On Willowbrook Lane, pet owners brought their animals to one man. Dr. Leonard Farrow wasn't just the town's veterinarian. He was the quiet healer with a stethoscope always at the ready, the one children waved to when walking their dogs past his clinic. But behind the white coat stitched with a paw print and the calm bedside manner, something unthinkable was taking root. It began as whispers. A mother slumped behind the wheel of her car. A retired neighbor never stirred from his evening milk. Weeks apart, nothing linked, until the funerals began overlapping and a single detail surfaced again and again. They had all recently seen Dr. Farrow. Hidden inside his drawers were bottles marked for animals, their labels crudely altered, and in his study lay a notebook with columns, stages, and red marks beside the fallen. Patients weren't dying by chance. They were being measured, cataloged, and crossed out. This is the story of a town that placed its faith in a man who fed poison in the guise of care, and of a clinic meant for healing that became a silent theater of betrayal. Welcome to Justice Uncovered. Subscribe and turn on the bell, because the mask of trust can hide the darkest design. The hall smelled of lilies, though the flowers were not lilies at all. 5 coffins, white and identical, stood in a line under the soft flicker of chandelier light. They looked less like vessels for grief and more like pieces on an assembly line, waiting to be moved, waiting to be closed forever. The organ began its low drone at 11 a.m., a sound stretched long and brittle, vibrating the ribcage of everyone seated. Then it fractured, drowned beneath the muffled sobs of families who sat in 2 rigid rows. Each cry broke like glass, sharp and incomplete, before dissolving into silence again. Children were hushed by trembling hands. A man removed his hat and clutched it against his chest. His whisper cracked. They were fine, just last month fine. On the lids of the coffins lay roses. Red roses, their petals damp with condensation, as if they had just been lifted from a refrigerator and laid in place without thought. Yet their arrangement was exact, symmetrical. Each bouquet tied with the same white ribbon, each ribbon holding a small rectangular card. One mourner leaned close, squinting. He pinched the edge of a card and read the name aloud, barely audible. "Condolences, Dr. Leonard Farrow." His lips tightened as he repeated it, this time louder. All of them, the same. Heads turned, murmurs swelled. A woman pressed her palm to her mouth as she noticed the repetition. Every coffin bore the same message in the same font, written with a printer's clean indifference. The roses, meant to soften the edge of grief, instead hardened it. They glowed red against the sterile white wood, transforming love into a badge of death. What should have been a private gesture now seemed like a signature. The air inside the funeral home thickened, as though the walls leaned closer with every whisper. A man in the back muttered, "Why him? Why the vet?" Another voice answered from across the aisle, thin and trembling. He treated their pets. He knew them all. The priest continued his reading, words hollow against the atmosphere. His voice trembled on a line about peace, but the audience no longer listened. Their eyes returned again and again to the roses, the ribbons, the cards, as if the objects themselves carried a hidden accusation. The coffins gleamed under the dim light, polished wood reflecting distorted images of the mourners. In that reflection, their faces looked drained, ghostly, already claimed by the same pallor as the dead inside. At 11:37 a.m. the organ ceased, leaving a silence heavy enough to press on every chest. One of the bouquets slipped slightly as a pallbearer adjusted his grip on the lid. A single rose detached, spinning slowly downward. Its fall seemed longer than gravity should allow, as though the air itself resisted its descent. The petal brushed the wood, then dropped onto the stone floor. The sound it made was louder than expected, a sharp tap that echoed across the hall. People flinched. It was only a flower, but the sound rang out like a gavel declaring a sentence. The kind of sound that sealed fate. Mothers drew children closer. Men shifted in their suits, eyes darting between the coffins and the roses, as if they feared the flowers themselves might move again. The priest closed his book, but no one stood. All remained fixed on the row of coffins, on the identical bouquets, on the cards that whispered a name over and over again. In that moment, the town seemed to understand that these deaths, scattered across weeks, were not random. They carried a symmetry too sharp to ignore. And the roses, bright, red, and bleeding against the white, marked the beginning of something that had only just revealed its shape. But this was only the beginning. Leonard Farrow was 52, and the only veterinarian the town had ever truly trusted. His voice carried the weight of someone who spent decades speaking more to animals than to people, low, steady, touched with a calmness that smoothed edges. Neighbors called him the doctor of the whole town, a phrase said with affection, not irony. When pets limped, coughed, or lay too still, their owners brought them through the glass door of his clinic. And when the owners themselves ached, backs strained, heads pounding, they sometimes asked for help too. Inside his clinic, the walls spoke louder than Leonard ever did. A shelf ran the length of the waiting room, stacked with framed photographs. Families posed with golden retrievers, cats with ribbons, horses leaning into smiling faces. Handwritten cards leaned between the frames. "Thank you for saving Daisy." "Forever grateful for Max." Children's drawings curled at the corners, crayon colors faded by the sun. On the counter stood porcelain figurines of dogs, cats, even a rabbit with chipped ears. To anyone who entered, the room was not just a veterinary clinic, it was a museum of trust. At 2 p.m. on a Thursday, a woman in her 40s brought in her spaniel, coughing violently. Leonard examined the dog, then patted its chest. His words came quiet. "She'll be fine, just rest." The woman hesitated, then rubbed her lower back. "Doctor, my back's killing me. Can't see my physician for weeks. Do you maybe?" Leonard opened a drawer beneath the counter, fingers resting on a small white bottle. He slid it forward, his tone unchanged. "Just try this, it helps." She took it with gratitude, as if he had handed her more than medicine. The exchange was repeated many times. People who entered for their pets left with something else tucked into purses or pockets. Small favors, silent agreements. His calm nod and whispered reassurance made them feel safe, as if his authority over animals extended to their own bodies. Yet behind the warmth of the shelves and the gifts lay another object, hidden, not displayed. In the back room, bolted into the wall, was a steel box with a narrow keyhole. The key never left the chain that hung beneath Leonard's shirt collar. When opened, the box revealed no thank you cards, no trinkets of affection. It contained only a cluster of small glass vials, labels faded, some stained with age, and a bundle of business cards bound with a rubber band. The names printed on those cards belonged to men and women who had died, some years ago, some more recently. Their faces had once smiled from the photographs on the outer shelves, but their names lived again here, gathered in silence, kept as though each belonged to a chapter of an unwritten record. The contrast was sharp. Outside the locked door, sunlight struck the photos of families with pets, a glowing testament to healing. Inside the steel box, darkness pressed close around relics of the dead, the trust they once carried preserved as if embalmed. Heaven and tomb divided by a single lock. CCTV footage from 3 a.m. showed the clinic not as a place of comfort but of ritual. The fluorescent bulb buzzed weakly, throwing intermittent light on Leonard seated at his desk. His coat hung loose around him. On the desk lay papers filled with numbers, weights, abbreviations scrawled in small, sharp strokes. He rolled up his sleeve, tied a band, and inserted a needle into the blue vein of his arm. The plunger sank slowly. He did not wince. He lifted the pen and wrote in his ledger, lines flowing in sequence, detached as though transcribing the pulse of an experiment. The camera caught his face tilted slightly, his expression blank, neither pain nor relief. Only the movement of the pen betrayed purpose. The lamp flickered, dimmed, then returned, giving the scene the rhythm of a stuttering film reel. Each flash of light froze him mid-gesture. Pen hovering, needle gleaming, shadow bending. Outside, the street was silent, shops shuttered, windows dark. The town slept, unaware that inside the clinic the doctor they trusted was measuring not heartbeats but thresholds. The shelves of gratitude in the waiting room would greet clients again the next morning, smiling photographs reflecting sunlight, porcelain figures standing guard. But beyond them, in the locked box and the dimmed office, another record was being written, one that no child's drawing would ever frame. At 3:27 a.m., the CCTV signal stuttered again. The lamp above his desk buzzed once more, casting his bent head in fractured light. The image froze on his silhouette leaning over the page, a figure not of healer but of experimenter, sketching boundaries between care and control. The bulb hissed, flickered, and the picture collapsed into static, leaving only the echo of pen strokes that no one else could hear. The town believed his shelves were shrines to their trust. They did not know the steel box was a tomb. And in the dim footage, as the light sputtered for the last time, Leonard's shadow leaned across the desk, the posture unmistakable, not a man writing notes but a figure dissecting life itself. The fracture did not arrive in one blow. It gathered layer by layer, until the weight of it reshaped the man who wore the white coat and soft smile. Leonard Farrow listened to people the way he had always listened to their pets, quietly, patiently, but their words left needles behind. At 10 a.m. on a Tuesday, a wealthy client leaned against the counter, leather shoes clicking on the tile, and smirked. "You're just a pet doctor, not a real physician." The phrase clung in the air, longer than it should have, sharper than it sounded. Leonard nodded as though the remark had been harmless, yet his fingers pressed too tightly around the vial he was holding. The liquid inside trembled, the surface catching a glint of green from the fluorescent light above. Each insult became another injection beneath the skin, not of chemical but of humiliation. A week later, during a lunch at the hospital, a physician from the human clinic brushed him off with a laugh. "Leave humans to us. You stick to animals." The words were said with levity, but they carried the blunt force of a slammed door. Leonard's silence was his only reply. He stacked the moments in his memory as though arranging bottles on a shelf, each insult labeled and stored. In the back office, stacked envelopes waited on the desk, their red stamps shouting overdue. The clinic carried the weight of a mortgage that bent his shoulders. The air conditioning had broken months earlier, replaced by an old fan rattling against the wall. Clients shifted in their seats and whispered, cold as a morgue. They meant nothing by it, but the phrase echoed inside him like prophecy. The clinic had begun to resemble not a place of healing, but a waiting room for the dead. By 9 p.m., when the street outside was empty, Leonard sometimes coughed until his chest tightened. A camera installed in the hallway for security caught him pausing mid-step, hand clutching at his ribs, lips pale. In his drawer lay prescriptions written in his name, refills for a heart condition he had neglected, the paper edges curled with time. His body had joined the chorus of betrayal, a specimen that no longer obeyed its own owner. On a shelf near his desk sat the framed photograph of his wife, smiling as though sunlight itself had caught in her hair. Next to it was a vial with her name written on the label in his own handwriting. Neighbors whispered still, "She died suddenly." The photograph glowed faintly in the lamplight, while the vial stood beside it like an epitaph carved in glass. For Leonard, this had been stage 0. There was no one else left in the house. His only son had left years ago, never returning, never riding. In the kennels behind the clinic, the animals remained constant, breathing softly in their cages, watching him with eyes that did not judge. Late at night, he leaned against the bars and murmured, "They stay. People don't." The dogs wagged their tails, cats blinked slowly, and the silence became his congregation. Their loyalty was unbroken, and that loyalty mocked the unreliability of every human connection he had ever held. On his desk lay a ledger bound in worn leather. It was not a medical record, at least not in the sense his clients would understand. The pages did not only list dosages for animals. They contained names, human names, written in lines beneath columns marked Stage I, Stage Roman II. Next to each name were numbers, weights, ratios, mg/kg. The script was tight, precise, as if each stroke of ink carved the humiliation it recorded into permanence. The ritual became familiar. He arranged blister packs of pills like dominoes, setting them upright, tapping them until they clicked against each other. He whispered dosages under his breath like incantations, the sound almost prayerful. 5 milligrams per kilo, 7 milligrams per kilo. His lips moved in rhythm with the rattling of pills inside their plastic shells. Each evening was a rehearsal, each calculation a rehearsal for control. One afternoon, a woman came in with her collie. She held her back, grimacing, and accepted a bottle from him after the examination. "Take one now," he suggested softly. She swallowed the tablet with a sip of water. Minutes later, her pupils dilated and her knees buckled. She gasped, collapsing against the counter. Leonard bent down, not in panic but in procedure. He drew another syringe, injected her with an agent to reverse what he had given. She shivered, then steadied, unaware of what had just been tested. Her voice broke, grateful. "Thank you. I hadn't eaten breakfast. That's all it was." "You skipped breakfast," Leonard repeated, his tone level as if confirming her excuse. She left smiling and he returned to his ledger. At 3 a.m. the clinic glowed only with the desk lamp in the back office. The CCTV camera captured the ritual in its quiet violence. Leonard sat hunched over the leather book, the pen digging deep into the page. He drew a single red line through a name, the ink bleeding across fibers, blooming outward like a wound that refused to clot. The bulb overhead flickered, casting the page in bursts of light and shadow. For a moment, it looked less like handwriting and more like blood spreading in water. His head tilted, eyes fixed on the stain of ink as though measuring its expansion. The clinic was silent but for the hum of the old fan and the scratch of his pen. The animals slept in their cages, the town slept in its houses, and Leonard marked his page with a gesture that closed one chapter and prepared another. The light above him buzzed once more, a stammering glow, before dimming to darkness. The unraveling began quietly, like the first notes of a song no one yet recognized. On a Thursday morning at 7 a.m., Helen Morrow was found slumped behind the wheel of her car. The engine still hummed, a faint vibration against the silence of the driveway. Her hand rested on the steering wheel as if she had simply paused, as if she meant to turn the key the next moment. The paramedics noted the pallor of her lips, the shallow breath that never deepened again. The report filed later read 2 words, possible allergy. In her purse lay a small white bottle tucked among receipts and a comb, its label smudged but still legible. She had taken the tablets faithfully, believing them no different from the others she had been given before. Her funeral came and went like a whisper. People spoke of her kindness, her laugh. No one asked about the pills, not then. The bouquet on her coffin was bright, roses pressed so close together their fragrance smothered the air. Her name was crossed from Leonard's ledger that night, ink dragging through the paper like a blade through flesh. 3 weeks later, at 2 a.m. on a Sunday, Raymond Holt never rose from his bed. His wife found him still under the quilt, chest rising only once before it stopped altogether. The lamp on the bedside table was still lit, casting a dim glow over a glass of milk half drunk. The milk had begun to curdle slightly in the warmth of the room, but beside it, standing upright and untouched, was the same kind of bottle Helen had carried. White plastic green pills rattling softly when moved. The coroner wrote cardiac failure, nothing suspicious, nothing beyond the ordinary. At his wake, neighbors leaned in to murmur. He was strong as an ox. Still, sometimes they just go. The air smelled of coffee brewed too long, bitter and thin. The words, like the coffee, left an aftertaste that lingered. It might have ended there, 2 scattered notes in the dark, but a third arrived, jarring, impossible to ignore. A boy, only 12, swallowed what he thought was his mother's medicine. She had left the bottle on the kitchen counter, rushing to answer a call. By the time she returned, he was pale, eyes wide, gasping with a rattle that turned the kitchen into a chamber of panic. She screamed for help, her voice tearing through the neighborhood at 5 p.m. on a quiet Wednesday. He collapsed before the ambulance arrived. The bottle lay open beside the sink, its lid rolling across the tile until it clicked against the baseboard and stopped. The town shuddered. A child's death was not something that could be folded neatly into paperwork or buried under quiet murmurs. His funeral filled the church to its doors, the sound of wailing echoing against the stained glass, refracting sorrow into color. Yet even then the bouquet was the same, roses red against white, as though the pattern refused to break. Over 6 weeks, 3 lives had slipped, each at a different tempo, yet bound by the same unseen rhythm. The pattern was not yet visible to those who lived inside it. To them these were tragedies unlinked, accidents scattered like separate storms. But together they formed chords, the beginning of a composition not of music but of silence, arranged by the hand of the man they trusted most. In the late hours, Leonard sat at his desk, pen poised above the leather ledger. Each name became a note, each dosage a mark on a staff. Helen crossed out, Raymond crossed out. The boy, initials only, ink smudged by the pressure of his hand. He tapped his pen against the desk as though conducting. To him, the pills clicked like metronomes, steady, precise, the tempo of mortality itself. Doctors at the hospital began to notice, though faintly, as if catching a melody half-heard. A young resident scrolled through digital records late one night. His eyes flicked between charts. Helen, allergic reaction; Raymond, cardiac failure; a child, respiratory collapse. He leaned back, frowning, then pulled the cases side by side on his monitor. The words on each report aligned too neatly like repeated stanzas. Shallow breathing. Sudden collapse. No trauma. His cursor hovered. He opened the medication history. Each name carried an identical note, a prescription, written not by a physician but supplied in a smaller, quieter place. The green highlight blinked on his screen. Shared source, Dr. Leonard Farrow. The glow from the monitor lit his face, turning his features pale, almost spectral. He whispered the name as though it had spoken itself. Farrow. His voice broke in the empty office, swallowed by the whir of machines and the hum of fluorescent light. In that moment, the deaths no longer seemed isolated. They aligned, each a note in a grim score, forming the first bars of a symphony that no one had asked to hear. The ledger in Leonard's office and the monitor in the hospital sang the same refrain, each pointing to the man with the soft voice, the steady hands, the shelves of gratitude, and the locked steel box hidden behind them. The composition had begun, and the town was only starting to hear its sound. The phrase appeared first in the morning paper, bold and green against the white, green pill epidemic. The headline stretched across the page like a wound no one could suture. The word green, once associated with spring and healing, now carried the chill of contagion. By noon, the phrase spread across radios, televisions, and whispered conversations in grocery aisles. Families who had buried their loved ones came forward, holding up the small plastic bottles as if they were relics of betrayal. Under the studio lights, the pills inside shimmered unnaturally. Cameras zoomed close until each capsule glowed, transformed from medicine into jewels of poison. A father lifted one between his fingers during a live interview, his hand trembling. "She trusted him," he said, his voice low. "We all did." The pill sparkled under the glare, an emerald shard disguised as help. Police began to collect bottles from houses marked by grief. In Helen's purse, in Raymond's bedside drawer, in the kitchen where the boy had collapsed, they found the same containers. Labels clean, yet carrying words that seemed absurd in the context of human death. For dogs. The font was small, clinical, but its presence was monstrous. It declared that what had entered their bodies was never meant for them, yet had passed their lips in trust. At every scene, the investigators noticed another pattern. Beside the bottles lay remnants of devotion to animals. A leash coiled neatly on a hook. A rubber ball gnawed by teeth. A framed photo of a cat curled on a lap. The objects radiated innocence, yet now served as witnesses. What had been symbols of affection had become silent testimony. The police cataloged them, yet even in their notes the contrast rang, toys of comfort paired with instruments of death. The community turned restless. Neighbors spoke in clipped tones, glancing over shoulders. At the diner, conversations hushed when the name Leonard Farrow surfaced. "He saved my horse," someone whispered. Another voice cut in, "and gave my sister those pills." The forks on plates scraped louder than the words. Inside his clinic, Leonard continued his rituals. The shelves still displayed the smiling photographs, the cards of thanks. Clients still entered, though with hesitation, their voices faltering as they asked for help. Leonard's gestures remained unchanged. A drawer opened. A bottle slid forward. "Just try this, it helps." His tone never cracked, yet in the ledger the names multiplied. When officers entered the clinic with a quiet warrant, they moved past the waiting room and into the back. They found the steel box unlocked for once, its key lying beside it like an oversight. Inside lay not only vials but pages of handwritten lists. The ink was dark, lines pressed so deeply into the paper that the impressions bled through to the next sheet. Names filled the columns, each assigned a stage. Stage 1, Stage 2. Alongside the names were marks in red, crosses drawn through some, circles around others. The investigators read silently, the only sound the turning of paper. Their faces hardened as they realized not all names belonged to clients. Mixed in were others, colleagues from the hospital, neighbors who had spoken dismissively. The lines of the list blurred the boundary between patients and personal enemies. It was not random. It was deliberate, structured like a program advancing by phases. One officer whispered, his voice dry. "These aren't just clients." He kept track of everyone. The ledger smelled faintly of antiseptic and ink. Its pages seemed heavy, as though saturated with the weight of the names it carried. The red markings glowed under the fluorescent bulb, crimson against the pale paper, like wounds that refused to close. At 6 p.m., police spread photographs of the bottles on a press table. Reporters leaned forward, flashes igniting like stuttering lightning. The words "for dogs" reflected in the lenses, seared into headlines. The town, once proud of its single veterinarian, now recoiled. In the back office, Leonard sat alone. He traced a finger down the latest column of names, pausing on one circled in red. His lips moved without sound, as if reciting a private vow. Around him, the clinic hummed with silence, the animals asleep in their cages, their breathing steady while the air above them carried the residue of secrets. On the final page of the ledger, beneath the last line of names, words had been written in letters larger than the rest. Final cohort. The ink bled deep into the paper, heavy and deliberate, as though stamped instead of written. It looked less like handwriting and more like a seal, a decree of punishment waiting to be enacted. The lamp flickered overhead, its hum merging with the silence of the room. The words glared up from the page, definitive, immovable. The list was no longer only a record, it had become a verdict. And in that verdict, the town's fate trembled. At first it looked ordinary. A man in a white coat, leaning forward with his voice low, offering a vial to a nervous client. The hidden camera tucked into the air vent caught the exchange without sound at first, only the choreography of trust. A hand extended, another withdrew, and between them the bottle gleamed in the sterile light. Then came the detail that shifted everything. Leonard's other hand slipping into his pocket, drawing out a chrome stopwatch. Its face reflected against his cheek, a quick blade of silver slicing across his expression. The gesture was practiced, almost rehearsed, as though the medicine and the timer belonged together in the same ritual. The client swallowed the capsule, reassured by Leonard's steady tone. For a moment, nothing happened. Then a twitch, a sudden stiffness of the shoulders, followed by the collapse of muscle control. The body jerked violently against the chair, the sound of heels scraping against tile. Leonard did not reach for oxygen or for a stethoscope. His gaze rested on the ticking dial, lips barely moving. The camera caught the shimmer of the second hand circling, each click loud in its silence. Later, when that footage was played back in a dim room filled with investigators, one voice whispered what no one could erase. He wasn't watching the patient, he was watching the timer. The survivor confirmed it. She had lived through the convulsions because the dose was imperfect, her metabolism slower. "I thought he would help," she said, voice raw, sitting beneath the interrogation lamp. But he just stared. He was measuring something, not saving me, measuring. Her hands shook as she mimed the motion of the ticking hand, repeating the rhythm like a curse she couldn't unhear. The walls of his clinic began to breathe secrets. Phones tapped, rooms wired. At 3 a.m., microphones hidden among the kennels caught his voice, calm but brittle, speaking into the still air. "I need the last horse batch," he murmured. The phrase drifted across static, carried into headphones worn by men who stared at one another in disbelief. Horse batch, the language of dosage, the scaling of poison not for humans but for weight, for endurance. He was recalibrating not for treatment but for endurance of suffering. In the evidence room, agents spread the bottles in rows. Most bore the familiar label, the clinical coldness of "for dogs." But buried among them, discovered behind a stack of files, lay another bottle. The sticker was misaligned, printed with letters slightly uneven. It read, "For kids' mild pain." The words pulsed in the fluorescent light. No one spoke for a long time. The idea of betrayal had already scarred the town, but this crossed into a territory no one dared imagine. The pills that promised gentleness for children carried the shadow of the same green poison. Investigators documented every detail. The font, the adhesive, the ink. Yet their notes could not capture the visceral recoil in the room. To mask poison beneath the promise of childhood relief was not only lethal, it was obscene. A pediatric softness, hijacked into camouflage for death. It was the line no healer, no scientist, no human should ever step across. Leonard's rituals grew more visible under surveillance. He no longer closed the blinds as carefully. Perhaps he felt invulnerable, or perhaps he wanted witnesses. He lined up pills on his desk, measured distances between them with a ruler, and whispered dosages under his breath like scripture. Stage I. Stage Roman II. He recited as though conducting a choir no one else could hear. The stopwatch rested beside him, its metal catching light whenever his hand brushed it, his reflection splitting across its surface into fragments. Those who watched him remotely noticed his patterns. Every time a client sat across from him, Leonard's fingers grazed the hidden pocket where the stopwatch waited. The gesture was unconscious, a tick of control. He lived less in the world of flesh than in the orbit of seconds and dosages, a man who no longer measured time by clocks but by collapses. The police debated when to intervene. Some urged immediate arrest, fearing another collapse. Others argued the net had to close tighter, the evidence gathered to an unbreakable weight. Each meeting ended in silence, eyes fixed on the bottle labeled "for kids." Its presence was like a wound in the room, impossible to turn away from. Meanwhile, clients still entered, unaware of the wires, the cameras, the hidden watchers. Leonard's voice carried the same calm notes. "Just try this. It helps." He wrote prescriptions in a hand as steady as always, though every loop of his pen seemed to echo the red circles in his ledger. The clinic smelled of disinfectant and damp fur, but underneath it lingered another odor, fear unspoken. Even the animals grew restless in their cages, pacing, whining, as though some vibration passed through the walls. At 7 p.m., a camera hidden in the shelf behind Leonard's desk zoomed close as he placed a new label onto a vial. The adhesive glistened, the paper smoothing beneath his thumb. The word gleamed under the lamp, "Kids." The letters shone with the cruel brightness of polished metal, not innocent but sharp as if carved with a blade. The camera froze on the word, the ink too black, the promise too hollow. It filled the frame like a wound exposed. And in that frame, the town's trust collapsed into a silence that no one could mend. The raid began without sirens, only the crunch of boots against gravel outside the clinic at 4 a.m. The town slept, but inside, fluorescent lights still hummed. Leonard had been awake, bent over his desk, arranging tablets into patterns that only he understood. When the door burst inward, the bottles scattered. One green vial rolled across the floor, knocking against the leg of his chair, circling in place like a compass needle losing its direction. Agents fanned into the room, their beams slicing the shadows, illuminating the fragments of his ritual. The notebook lay open, spine cracked, pages filled with columns. Dosages aligned against names, dates matched to symptoms, and in one chilling grid, dose met death. The ink was meticulous, red lines marking thresholds, black numbers recording failures. On the desk, the stopwatch rested like an executioner's blade, its face reflecting the chaos around it. Yet Leonard did not flinch. He sat as though he had expected this intrusion, hands calm, eyes measuring distance rather than danger. One officer froze at a detail no one wanted to acknowledge. A separate vial sat apart from the rest, its label older, edges frayed. The name written on it was not a client's, not a stranger's, but his wife's. Beside it in the notebook, the earliest entry bore a single phrase, Stage 0. 10 years earlier, the experiment had begun not with an enemy, not with a patient, but with the woman he once held. The betrayal was not sudden invention, it had roots reaching back a decade. The room stilled. Gloves hovered above the page, unwilling to touch, unwilling to break the timeline that had just expanded backward into unimaginable cruelty. Leonard's lips curved, not in a smile but in something sharper, an admission without apology. "It started with her," he murmured, "proof that love is the most dangerous placebo." His words hung in the sterile air, suspended between confession and theory. Hands seized him, steel cuffs locking around his wrists. Yet even bound, he did not resist. He spoke as though to himself, but his voice carried across the room. "Humans are just larger animals." The sentence landed with a thud of recognition. His profession, his license, his life had all been scaffolding for this belief. The boundary between pet and person had collapsed in his mind, and what had begun in the kennel had bled into the street, the home, the town. Investigators swept through the clinic, pulling open drawers, tearing apart shelves. Beneath a stack of veterinary journals, they found a laptop still glowing. The screen bathed the walls in a sickly light, illuminating the dust that swirled in the disturbed air. Files stretched across the desktop in neat order. Among them, one folder opened with a double click, revealing a document named with clinical precision, Phase Roman II Shelter Volunteers. Names listed in columns, paired with projected doses. Unlike his earlier victims, these were not clients, not paying customers. They were volunteers from the animal shelter, people who had offered themselves freely to help creatures in need. Their generosity had placed them on his stage. The file scrolled downward, revealing dozens of names, each one marked with annotations in his hand. Notes about weight, medical history, even casual remarks about smiles or laughter, captured with the detachment of a lab report. He had mapped them as though they were data points, not lives. The discovery shifted the room's gravity. Stage 0 was no longer the beginning and the arrests no longer the end. The experiment had another phase waiting, a deeper abyss yet untouched. Agents exchanged glances that carried no words, only dread. The plan had not been to stop, it had been to escalate. Leonard watched them read, his face lit by the glow of the screen. In that light, his features seemed almost carved, detached from the man they thought they knew. His voice, low and measured, cut into the silence. Phase Roman II was refinement, cleaner, broader. They would have thanked me. He leaned forward, cuffs biting into his skin as though eager to explain, but no one asked for more. The horror of the file spoke louder than his calmness ever could. As they pulled him to his feet, the room filled with fragments, bottles tipped on their sides, pages curling with red ink bleeding through, the stopwatch lying face up, still and accusing. Every object told a story of trust inverted, tools of care turned to instruments of decay. They dragged him past the kennels, the dogs barking, the cats scratching at bars. The animals sensed the fracture, their noise a chorus of dissonance. Leonard glanced once toward them, his expression unreadable, as though weighing whether their loyalty had exceeded that of the humans who had mocked him. The laptop remained on the desk, screen flickering. Lines of text pulsed in the glow until the last file closed itself, and the words Phase Roman II filled the monitor in bold type. The letters blinked once, twice, then the screen went black. Darkness reclaimed the clinic, leaving only the echo of chains and the memory of a plan unfinished. The sign came down first. The screws groaned as if reluctant, but the metal frame yielded to the drill, and the letters of Farrow Veterinary Clinic were lowered, plank by plank, until nothing remained but 4 pale shadows imprinted on the brick. The town stood in silence as the outline lingered, a ghost inscription carved by sun and weather. It was not a clinic anymore, only a wound in plaster, a scar that no paint could hide. People passed with leashes held tight, eyes darting to the empty building. Dogs pulled against their collars, uneasy without knowing why, while cats were carried away in covered crates, hidden from the sight of the door. The trust had broken wider than one man. It had cracked the idea of the profession itself. No one wanted appointments. No one trusted prescriptions. In whispered tones, residents spoke of leaving town entirely, unwilling to live where healing had turned into a tomb. At the courthouse, the evidence sat under lock. The green pill, small and unremarkable in form, lay sealed within a clear plastic box. Under the white wash of fluorescent light, it gleamed unnaturally, like a jewel that promised not wealth but mourning. The label, still bearing the veterinary dosage, was smudged with the oils of hands that once trusted it. Officers looked away when they passed the shelf, as though fearing eye contact with the object might invite contamination. What had once been given in kindness was now displayed as relic, an artifact of betrayal preserved for trial. The town absorbed symbols faster than facts. Children no longer drank from green cups. Families avoided green paint for walls. Even holiday decorations bent away from the shade. The color had shifted meaning. Once it evoked spring, renewal, growth. Now it stood for collapse, sudden stillness, the memory of breath lost in sleep. Every object carrying the hue seemed poisoned by association. People whispered the phrase that had once run across headlines, "green pill epidemic," and the words clung like mildew to their mouths. Inside the darkened clinic, dust began its slow work. Shelves emptied of bottles now gathered particles that settled evenly, erasing difference between surface and stain. The air smelled faintly of chemical residue, lingering even after the drawers had been emptied. In one corner, a leash forgotten by a client lay curled like a snake. The metal clasp, dulled by neglect, reflected a slice of light that filtered through the high window. The leash had no dog to claim it, no hand to pull it. It existed only as a memory of ownership severed. Those who had lost loved ones gathered not in churches but in kitchens. They placed the prescription bottles on tables like headstones, each container holding the invisible line between treatment and execution. The sound of caps twisting open had once been ordinary. Now it rang like the click of a weapon. A mother held up her son's vial in a reporter's camera glare, the plastic glowing under flash, as though the object itself wanted to confess. "This killed him," she said. Her voice trembled not from volume but from the weight of holding the symbol in her hand. Even among law enforcement, unease spread. The file marked Phase Roman II had been encrypted, copied, catalogued. Yet the words retained their pulse. Shelter volunteers. The idea that there were names still unreached, a stage unrealized, left officers checking their own cabinets, examining their own pets' prescriptions under lamp light. No one could be sure how far the distribution had stretched. A shadow hung over every unsealed container. Leonard himself had been removed from the town, but the residue of his logic clung to its walls. The statement he had uttered, "Humans are just larger animals," repeated in newscasts, in bar conversations, in nightmares. Each time it was spoken, it seemed to hollow out the boundary that people had once relied on. In its place grew suspicion, not just of medicine, but of intimacy, of professions built on trust, of the fragile line between care and control. The clinic chair remained. The leather cracked, the metal frame cold to touch. It sat in the center of the room where countless animals had been lifted, examined, comforted. Now it bore only silence. Dust layered the seat like a shroud, disturbed only when a beam of light crossed the window pane and cut diagonally across its surface. The chair stood as the final witness, its emptiness louder than testimony. On certain afternoons, children passing would glance through the glass. They saw not a room but an altar to something gone wrong. The chair, lit from behind, seemed suspended, a throne for absence. No one entered, no one dared to sweep or claim it. Time itself had given the verdict, leaving the object untouched, frozen in judgment. The town moved around it, slower, quieter, as if unwilling to provoke what lingered there. But each glance at the boarded door, each whisper about the pills, each dog pulled away from the corner reinforced the same truth. Betrayal had no clean ending. It bled outward, staining memory, reshaping rituals, turning familiar shapes into ruins of meaning. And in the final image, the camera of memory held steady on the chair. Dust rising in soft clouds, glass fractured with streaks of sun, shadows stretching long across the floor. It was no longer a clinic seat. It was vacancy embodied, the eternal posture of something trusted, then broken, left to stand in silence forever.